The tired groan of the transmission echoed through the biting mountain air of Aspen on Christmas Eve as Michelle gripped the steering wheel of her old Dodge Caravan, her knuckles white with a mixture of cold and frustration. In the back, her 6-year-old triplets, Madison, Ethan, and Sophia, were in the midst of a particularly off-key rendition of a holiday song. "Mom, are we there yet?" Madison chirped, the question a familiar refrain on their long journey. Michelle managed a strained smile. "Almost there, sweetheart. A complete fabrication." They had been circling the winding mountain roads for the better part of an hour, and the van was protesting every incline. A menacing orange light on the instrument cluster, the check engine icon, pulsed like a harbinger of doom. The car's making a weird noise, Ethan noted with the solemnity only a 6-year-old can muster. Before Michelle could offer a reassuring lie, the engine sputtered, coughed violently, and fell silent. The sudden quiet was deafening. "Come on," Michelle whispered, a rare moment of weakness slipping past her usual rule of perfect composure in front of the kids. From the back, a tiny whimper started from Sophia. "Are we lost?" "No, my love. It's just a Christmas adventure," Michelle improvised, her voice a mask of confidence she was far from feeling. She stepped out of the van, the frigid Aspen air hitting her with the force of a physical blow. And then she saw it. Stonegate Estate, a sprawling mansion lit against the encroaching darkness like a beacon of impossible warmth and wealth. "Kids, stay here." "Mom's going to ask for help," Michelle commanded, her tone brokering no argument. Her boots crunched on the pristinely shoveled driveway as she passed through ornate iron gates, each step on the flagstone path a stark reminder of how utterly out of place she felt. Hesitating for only a second, Michelle pressed the doorbell. A melodic chime echoed from within, seeming to announce her as an intruder into a world she only ever cleaned. The heavy oak door swung open, revealing a man who was her complete opposite. Where her face was etched with the fine lines of exhaustion and worry, his radiated a smooth, easy refinement. His cashmere robe was the very definition of quiet luxury. But it was his eyes that held her, intensely blue, now wide with a flicker of surprise and mild annoyance. "May I help you?" His voice was smooth and confident, a low baritone that commanded attention. Michelle's own voice caught in her throat, the words to explain her predicament tangled in a knot of pride and desperation. A sudden shout sliced through the cold air. "Mom?" The man's entire demeanor shifted. The mask of polite distance dissolved into genuine alarm. "You have children?" he asked, his gaze darting past her towards the dark shape of the minivan. Michelle simply nodded. "Triplets? Our car broke down and—" "Come in," he interrupted, pulling the door wider. "I'm Richard. It seems you've had quite a complicated night." As Michelle turned to wave her children over, she saw Richard's expression soften as the 3 small figures scrambled out of the van and approached, hesitant and bundled up. "Hi," Sophia said, her voice a timid whisper as she hid behind Michelle's coat. Richard knelt, bringing himself down to their level with a practiced ease. "Hello, little ones. How about some hot chocolate while we help your mom?" At the mere mention of chocolate, the triplets' eyes went wide, all previous shyness evaporating. "Yes, please," Ethan exclaimed, bolting past his mother to be the first one inside. Michelle watched, a little stunned, as her children followed this stranger into his home as if he were a long-lost uncle. The inside of Stonegate Estate was even more breathtaking. Soaring ceilings with exposed wood beams, a massive stone fireplace, and artwork that probably cost more than her house. "Wow, you're rich," Madison blurted out, causing Michelle to flush with embarrassment. Richard let out a surprisingly warm, genuine laugh. "Let's just say I'm lucky. Come, the kitchen's this way." In a kitchen that looked like it belonged in a magazine, Richard moved with a surprising competence, preparing 3 mugs of gourmet hot chocolate. Soon the kids were seated at a vast marble island, sipping happily and sporting frothy mustaches. "So," Richard began, turning his attention to Michelle, "how can I help?" Michelle quickly explained their situation, the dead minivan, the fact they were heading home after she'd finished her last cleaning job of the season. "A cleaner?" Richard asked, one eyebrow arching slightly. "Yes," Michelle answered, her chin lifting in a gesture of defiance. "Is that a problem?" Richard smiled, a real smile that reached his startling blue eyes. "Not at all. I admire hard-working people." Just then, Richard's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, his face hardening into a professional mask. "Excuse me, I need to take this call," he said, stepping out of the kitchen. Michelle caught snippets of a hushed, intense conversation, words like bored, liability, and urgent. When he returned, he looked as if the weight of the world had settled back onto his shoulders. "Is everything all right?" Michelle asked, surprised by her own impulse to offer comfort. Richard forced a smile. "Nothing that can't wait until tomorrow. Now, about your car." Before he could finish, a low rumble from outside grew into a roar. They rushed to the window to see that the distant threat of a snowstorm had descended upon Aspen with a vengeance, a blizzard blanketing the world in a swirling vortex of white. "I don't think anyone's going anywhere tonight," Richard murmured, his voice grim. Panic began to prickle at Michelle's chest, the thought of being trapped here, a charity case in a stranger's mansion. As if reading her mind, Richard quickly added, "I have enough guest rooms. You can stay until the storm passes and we figure out the car situation." Michelle hesitated. Her entire adult life had been a battle for independence, a refusal to rely on anyone. But as she looked at her children, their faces flushed and happy, safe from the storm, she knew she had no other choice. "Thank you," she said, the words feeling inadequate. "I promise we'll make it up to you somehow." Richard shook his head. "No need. Consider it a Christmas gift." As he led them to a wing of the house with guest suites, Michelle couldn't escape the feeling that, for all its grandeur, Stonegate Estate felt empty, achingly lonely. After tucking her children into bed softer than anything they'd ever known, Michelle allowed herself a moment of quiet vulnerability. "What are we doing here?" she whispered into the darkness. "Mom," Sophia called out sleepily from her bed. "I like Mr. Richard. He seems sad like you sometimes." Michelle's breath caught. She crossed the room and kissed her daughter's forehead, stunned by the child's simple, piercing observation. "Sleep, darling. Tomorrow is a new day." Lying in the luxurious bed, the silk sheets a foreign caress against her skin, Michelle replayed the night's impossible events. A broken-down minivan, a mysterious mansion, a lonely millionaire. It felt like the opening scene of a Hallmark movie, but she knew life wasn't a fairy tale. Tomorrow the storm would pass, the van would be fixed, and they would return to their reality. She had no idea that fate, and the storm raging outside, was just the beginning of an emotional whirlwind that was about to change all of their lives forever. Dawn broke over a world transformed, a silent, pristine landscape of white. The blizzard had passed, leaving Aspen buried in a thick blanket of fresh powder. Michelle woke up feeling disoriented, the unfamiliar weight of a down comforter, a reminder of their strange circumstances. "Mom, look at the snow!" Ethan's excited shout brought her fully back to the present. She got up to find all three of her children with their faces pressed against the panoramic window, their eyes wide with awe. "Can we play outside?" Madison asked, practically vibrating with energy. "Let's see what Mr. Richard says," Michelle replied, stalling for time as she tried to wrap her head around their situation. Downstairs, the scent of fresh coffee led them to the kitchen. Richard was already there, looking out at the snow-covered grounds, a coffee mug cradled in his hands. He looked as if he hadn't slept at all. "Good morning," he said, turning with a tired smile. "Coffee?" Michelle nodded gratefully. "The kids are excited about the snow." Richard's gaze drifted back to the window, a shadow of something unreadable crossing his features. "The backyard is safe for them to play in. But first, breakfast." As the children happily devoured a mountain of pancakes, Michelle found herself studying Richard. There was a tension in his posture, a deep-seated sadness that went beyond a single sleepless night. "Did you sleep?" she asked, the question slipping out before she could stop it. Richard shook his head. "Work. Always work. It must be hard running such a big company." He looked at her, surprised. "How do you know about the company?" Michelle felt a blush creep up her neck. "I overheard some of your conversation last night. Sorry, I didn't mean to pry." Richard waved it away. "It's fine. It's complicated. Tough decisions." "Sometimes an outside perspective helps," Michelle offered. "I know I'm just a cleaner, but—" "Just a cleaner?" Richard interrupted, his voice gentle but firm. "You're a single mother, raising triplets and running your own cleaning business. That requires more skill and courage than many CEOs I know." The unexpected compliment left Michelle momentarily speechless. Before she could find a response, the children jumped in. "Can we go play now?" Sophia pleaded. "Yeah." Richard's face broke into the first genuine smile Michelle had seen. "Sure, I'll show you the way." While the kids scrambled to get into their snow gear, Michelle saw Richard pull something from a hall closet drawer. They were children's snow gloves. "They were my stepdaughters," he explained, noticing her gaze. She loved the snow. The pain in that simple statement was so profound, it made Michelle's heart ache. Outside, the sound of the children's laughter filled the crisp mountain air, breaking the profound silence of the morning. Michelle watched from the doorway, torn between the joy of seeing her kids so happy and the anxiety of their precarious situation. "They look happy," Richard commented, coming to stand beside her. Michelle nodded. "Thank you for this. For everything?" "It's good to see life in this house again," he murmured, almost to himself. Back inside, Michelle felt a desperate need to be useful. "Can I clean something?" "As a way to thank you." Richard looked almost pained. "You don't have to. You're not my employee." "I know, but I'd feel better doing something in return for your hospitality." After a moment's thought, Richard relented. "If you insist, you can organize the library. It's the only part of the house I use regularly, besides the office." In the library, surrounded by floor-to-ceiling shelves of leather-bound classics, Michelle felt like an interloper. She began to work, dusting and straightening, trying not to think about the immense value of the objects she was handling. That's when she saw it. A photograph in a heavy silver frame on the corner of the massive desk. A young woman, radiant, smiling directly at the camera. Michelle froze. It was like looking at a reflection, but not quite. The woman was younger, her features softer and more polished, but the resemblance, the shape of the eyes, the curve of the smile, was undeniable. "Find something interesting?" Richard's voice made her jump. He was standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "I'm sorry, Who is she?" Michelle asked, unable to stop herself. Richard walked over, his hand gently taking the frame. His fingers brushed over the glass. "Elizabeth, my late wife." The shock must have been visible on Michelle's face, because Richard's brow furrowed. "Are you all right?" Michelle shook her head, trying to clear it. "It's just, she looks so much like me." Richard's gaze shifted from the photograph to Michelle, and his eyes widened in sudden, dawning recognition. "My God," he breathed. "You're right. How did I not notice before?" The silence that followed was thick with unspoken questions. "How did she—" Michelle started, unsure if she had the right to ask. "Cancer," Richard answered, his voice low and flat. 3 years ago." "I'm so sorry," Michelle said, the words feeling hollow and inadequate. Richard gave a curt nod, his eyes lost in the past. "She always wanted children, you know. But we could never have them." The joyful shrieks of the children outside shattered the heavy moment. Richard blinked, as if waking from a dream. "I should check on them," he said, leaving the room abruptly. Michelle remained, her eyes fixed on the photograph, 1,000 questions swirling in her mind. Who was this woman? Why did they look so alike? Could it just be a bizarre coincidence? Glancing out the window, she saw Richard with her children. He was showing Ethan how to pack the perfect snowball, laughing at something Madison had shouted. For a fleeting moment, he looked years younger, the weight he carried seeming to lift. Michelle felt a pang in her chest. Gratitude, yes, but something else, too. Something more complicated she wasn't ready to name. She returned to her work, trying to push the confusing thoughts away, but the image of Elizabeth seemed to follow her, a silent witness, a reminder that there was more to this story than a broken-down van. Outside, the snow continued to fall in a gentle, silent cascade, burying the world in white, promising either a new beginning or the unearthing of secrets long hidden. Michelle didn't know what the future held, but she had a distinct feeling her life was about to change forever, and it all began with a dead battery and a photograph in a stranger's mansion on Christmas Eve. The sound of childish laughter, a noise long absent, echoed through the grand halls of Stonegate Estate. Madison, Ethan, and Sophia darted from room to room, their eyes wide with the thrill of discovery at what seemed to them a magical castle. "Mom, look at this," Ethan called, pointing to a massive antique globe in the office. Michelle smiled, watching her children explore, but her smile masked a growing unease. How long could they impose on Richard's generosity? How could she ever repay him? Her thoughts were shattered by a sudden crash, followed by a sharp, startled cry. Michelle sprinted to the living room, her heart hammering against her ribs. Sophia stood frozen, a look of pure horror on her face, before a shattered vase. Shards of delicate porcelain lay scattered across the polished hardwood floor. "I'm sorry, Mom. I didn't mean to," Sophia wailed, tears streaming down her cheeks. Before Michelle could even begin to react, Richard appeared. His eyes took in the scene, the broken vase, Sophia's terrified expression, and to Michelle's astonishment, he smiled. "It's okay, little one," he said, crouching down beside Sophia. "You know what? I never really liked that vase anyway." Sophia sniffled, looking up at him with a wobbly, hesitant smile. "Really?" Richard nodded with solemn gravity. "Absolutely. In fact, you did me a favor." Michelle watched, stunned, as Richard calmly comforted her daughter and began carefully picking up the larger pieces of the broken vase. His effortless kindness toward her children was disarming. Later, once the kids had tired themselves out and were dozing on a plush sofa, Michelle sat in the vast kitchen with a cup of tea, allowing herself a moment to reflect. Her mind drifted back to the early days with the triplets. Flashback. The incessant overlapping cries of 3 infants filled their tiny, cramped apartment. Michelle, bone-weary with dark circles under her eyes, rocked Madison in her arms while Ethan and Sophia screamed from their shared crib. "Shh, it's okay," she'd murmured, more for her own benefit than for the babies. A mountain of bills sat on the kitchen counter. Rent past due, a dwindling supply of diapers, and no clear idea of when she could possibly return to work. "You'll be fine," she'd promised them, her own silent tears tracking paths through the exhaustion on her face. "Mommy will figure it out." Back in the present, Michelle blinked away the memory. Those first few years had been a special kind of hell, but she'd made it. They'd survived. "A penny for your thoughts?" Richard's voice pulled her back to the present. Michelle offered a faint smile. "Just remembering." Richard sat across the wide kitchen island from her, nursing his own cup of tea. "It must have been tough at first." "You have no idea," Michelle replied, then paused. "Or maybe you do." "I'm sorry about your loss." Richard nodded, his gaze distant. "Elizabeth? She would have been a wonderful mother." The silence that settled between them was heavy, filled with unspoken grief and shared understanding. Michelle found herself wanting to comfort this man she barely knew, but the words wouldn't come. "Your kids are amazing," Richard said finally, breaking the quiet. "You've done a wonderful job with them." Michelle felt a warm blush of pride. "Thank you. They are my life." Richard looked over at the triplets sleeping peacefully on the sofa, a sad smile playing on his lips. "They've brought so much life back into this house in just one day. I can't remember the last time I heard laughter here." Michelle followed his gaze, feeling a surge of love for her children, but it was mingled with a pang of guilt. She was bringing this man a joy that was, by its very nature, temporary. "Richard," she began hesitantly, "about the vase." He held up a hand, cutting her off. "Don't even think about it. Honestly, it was refreshing to see someone treat this house like a home, not a museum." His words took her by surprise. She had always viewed wealth as a protective barrier, something to be preserved. But here was Richard, a man who had everything, seemingly longing for the very chaos she considered her daily reality. "May I ask something personal?" Michelle heard herself say before she could think better of it. Richard raised an eyebrow, but nodded. "The photo of Elizabeth? Why do we look so alike?" The question hung in the air. Richard was quiet for a long moment, staring into his teacup. "Honestly, I don't know," he said at last. "Elizabeth was adopted as a baby. She always wanted to find her biological family, but—" He didn't have to finish. Cancer had stolen her chance. A chill went down Michelle's spine. Adopted. The resemblance. "I never knew my biological parents either," Michelle admitted, her voice quiet. "I grew up in foster homes." Richard's eyes widened, the pieces clicking into place for both of them at the same time. The air between them crackled with unspoken possibilities. Before either of them could articulate the thought, the sound of small, shuffling footsteps interrupted them. Ethan appeared in the kitchen doorway, rubbing sleep from his eyes. "Mom, I'm hungry," he mumbled. The tension shattered. Michelle stood, grateful for the interruption. "Let's fix you something to eat, honey." As she and Richard moved around the kitchen, a comfortable team preparing sandwiches for the kids, Michelle couldn't stop her mind from racing. The questions, the possibilities, were overwhelming. Watching Richard interact with her children, showing Madison the proper way to spread mayonnaise, making Sophia giggle with a silly face, she felt something shift deep inside her. This mansion, which had at first felt so cold and alienating, was beginning to feel like a haven. The thought terrified her. They would have to leave, return to their real life, a life far removed from this temporary fairy tale. But as she saw the genuine smile on Richard's face, the light in his eyes as he played with her children, she couldn't help but wonder. What if this wasn't just a random accident? What if this chance encounter was the start of something more? With the image of Elizabeth's face still burned into her memory and Richard's words echoing in her ears, Michelle knew they were just scratching the surface of a profound mystery, a mystery that had the power to change all their lives forever. Dawn had barely kissed the snowy peaks of Aspen when Michelle slipped out of the mansion, determined to assess the damage to the van herself. The biting cold was a shock to the system, but she pulled the borrowed coat tighter and pressed on. Reaching the old Dodge Caravan, she popped the hood with a practiced heave, her eyes scanning the familiar landscape of the engine. Years of financial necessity had made her a surprisingly competent amateur mechanic. "Come on, old friend," she murmured, her breath pluming in the frigid air. "What's the matter with you?" Her calloused hands moved with confidence, checking connections and belts. She was so engrossed in her task she didn't hear Richard's approach until he spoke. "Impressive." His voice startled her. "I didn't know that besides cleaning, you were also a mechanic." Michelle turned, offering a shy smile. "When you're a single mom, you learn a bit of everything." Richard moved closer, peering into the engine bay with genuine curiosity. "Any idea what the problem is?" "Seems like the alternator," Michelle said, pointing, "but I'm not sure without the right tools." Richard nodded, his interest piqued. "Can I help somehow?" Michelle hesitated, her fierce independence warring with the practical offer. "Maybe you have some tools I could use?" she asked finally. "Sure," Richard replied instantly. "In the garage. Come, I'll show you." As they walked towards the detached garage, Michelle noticed how different Richard seemed out here, more relaxed and grounded away from the imposing grandeur of the main house. The garage itself was an enthusiast's dream, with walls of meticulously organized tools and, under a canvas cover, the unmistakable shape of a classic sports car. "Wow," she breathed, her eyes lighting up at the sight of the pristine tool chests. Richard smiled, clearly pleased. "Feel free to use whatever you need. I used to enjoy working on cars too, but, well, it's been a while." Michelle grabbed a socket wrench and a few other essentials and headed back to her van, Richard trailing behind. As she worked, he watched, occasionally asking a question or offering a quiet suggestion. "You really know your stuff," he commented after a few minutes of watching her work. Michelle shrugged, not looking up from the engine. "Necessity is the mother of invention, as they say." "And the children's father?" Richard asked quietly. "He doesn't help?" Michelle's hand stilled for a fraction of a second before she resumed her work, her voice tight. "There is no father, at least not one that matters." Richard seemed to sense he'd hit a nerve and wisely changed the subject. "You know, I'm impressed by your determination. A lot of people would have just given up and called a tow truck." "I can't afford to give up," Michelle replied simply. After a moment she added, "Besides, this car, it's more than just transportation. It's part of the family," Richard finished, a sympathetic smile on his face. Michelle nodded, surprised he understood. Bolstered by his empathy, she voiced the question that had been haunting her. "Richard, about the photo in the library? Your wife." Richard's smile faded, replaced by a guarded look. "Elizabeth? Yes?" "Elizabeth," Michelle continued, choosing her words with care. "You mentioned she was adopted. Did you ever find anything about her biological family?" Richard was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the snow-covered mountains in the distance. When he finally spoke, his voice was laced with emotion. "Elizabeth always wanted to know more about her roots. We hired detectives, did DNA tests, but the trails always led to dead ends." Michelle felt her own heart begin to hammer against her ribs. "And you never found anything?" Richard hesitated, as if weighing how much to share. There were rumors, about a sister maybe, but nothing concrete. The sound of metal clattering on the pavement echoed in the still air as Michelle dropped the wrench. "A sister?" Richard looked at her, his gaze intense, as if he were trying to piece together a complex puzzle. "Michelle, do you think, could there be a connection between you and Elizabeth?" Michelle swallowed hard, her mind reeling. I don't know. It's quite a coincidence, isn't it? Our resemblance, both adopted. Sometimes coincidences are the universe trying to tell us something," Richard murmured, more to himself than to her. The silence that fell between them was charged with unspoken questions and tantalizing possibilities. It was broken by the sound of small, running feet. "Mom! Mr. Richard!" Sophia's excited voice cut through the tension. "Breakfast is ready?" Michelle and Richard exchanged a look. This conversation wasn't over, but it would have to wait. "We're coming, sweetheart," Michelle called back, closing the hood of the van. Turning to Richard, she whispered, "Thank you for your help and for your honesty." Richard nodded, his gaze still searching hers. "Michelle, if you'd like, we could investigate further, together." The offer hung in the air between them, a fragile bridge between two separate worlds. Michelle knew that accepting it could unleash a torrent of emotions and revelations. But the chance to finally learn the truth about where she came from, to understand the connection she felt to the woman in the photograph. "Let's think about it after breakfast," she replied at last, offering a small, uncertain smile. As they walked back to the mansion side by side, Michelle couldn't shake the feeling that they were standing on the precipice of something monumental, something that would irrevocably alter the course of their lives. The mystery of the photograph, of Elizabeth's past, of her own story, it was all converging in a way she never could have imagined when her minivan broke down on the side of a mountain road on Christmas Eve. And as she stepped into the warm kitchen, to the sight of her children's smiling faces and Richard flipping pancakes as if it were the most natural thing in the world, she wondered if maybe, just maybe, this wasn't the end of a journey, but the beginning of a much greater one. The rich aroma of coffee filled the kitchen as Michelle and Richard sat at the marble island after breakfast. The children's laughter drifted in from the adjacent living room, a cheerful counterpoint to the comfortable silence between the adults. Richard seemed preoccupied, absently stirring his coffee, a deep furrow in his brow. "Something's bothering you," Michelle finally observed, stating it as a fact rather than a question. Richard looked up, a flicker of surprise in his eyes at her directness. He hesitated, then seemed to decide. "It's complicated," he began. "My company is facing an ethical dilemma." Michelle leaned forward, her interest piqued. "What kind of dilemma?" Richard let out a long, weary sigh. "We discovered that one of our suppliers is using questionable labor practices. It's not exactly illegal, but it's on the edge of ethics." "And you're thinking of cutting ties with them," Michelle surmised. "That's the problem," Richard said, running a hand through his hair in frustration. "If we cut them off, hundreds of people lose their jobs. But if we continue, we're essentially condoning practices that go against everything I believe in." Michelle was quiet for a moment, processing the weight of his choice. When she spoke, her voice was calm and measured. "You know, as a cleaner, I've worked in places that treated their employees as disposable," she began. "I've also seen the impact that losing a job can have on a family." Richard looked at her, clearly intrigued by her perspective. "Maybe," Michelle continued, "the issue isn't whether to cut or keep, but how you can use your influence to improve the situation." "How so?" Richard asked, leaning forward, now genuinely engaged. "What if, instead of simply cutting ties, you use your position to demand changes?" Michelle suggested. "Set ethical standards as a condition to continue the partnership. That way, you don't just keep jobs, you also improve working conditions." Richard stared at her, a look of mingled surprise and admiration on his face. "That's brilliant, actually. I don't know why I didn't think of it before." Michelle shrugged, a small smile playing on her lips. "Sometimes it takes an outside perspective, someone who's been on the other side of the equation." "You surprise me at every turn, Michelle," Richard said softly. "Thank you." The moment was broken by an excited shout from the other room. "Mom! Mr. Richard, look what we found!" Michelle and Richard rose quickly, following the sound of the children's voices. They found the triplets huddled around an old dusty box they'd apparently unearthed from a forgotten corner of the living room. "What do you have there?" Michelle asked, kneeling beside them. Madison held up a worn photo album, her eyes shining. "Old pictures." "Look, Mr. Richard, is that you?" Richard moved closer, his face blanching slightly as he recognized the album. "Where did you find this?" "It fell behind the sofa when we were playing hide-and-seek," Ethan explained. Michelle watched Richard carefully as he took the album, his hands trembling slightly as he opened it. "Are these pictures of you and Mrs. Elizabeth?" Michelle asked gently. Richard nodded, his voice thick with emotion. "And our family, friends, a lifetime of memories." The children, sensing the shift in the atmosphere, fell quiet, watching with curiosity as Richard slowly turned the pages. Michelle was about to suggest they leave him to his memories when the doorbell chimed, its shrill, insistent ring cutting through the quiet house. "I'll get it," she said, rising quickly. At the door, she found a man in a sharp suit, his expression all business. "Good afternoon," he said, his voice clipped and professional. "I'm Dr. Rodriguez, Mr. Richard's attorney. I need to speak to him urgently." Michelle hesitated for a beat before stepping aside. "Of course, please come in. I'll call him." Returning to the living room, she found Richard still lost in the photo album, the children sitting quietly beside him. "Richard," she called softly, "your lawyer is here. He says it's urgent." Richard looked up as if shaking himself out of a trance. "Dr. Rodriguez? Now?" He stood, carefully placing the album back in its box. "Kids, Why don't you go play outside for a bit?" The triplets, sensing the tension, obeyed without a word. Michelle followed them to the back door, making sure they were bundled up before she returned. In the living room, Richard and Dr. Rodriguez were already deep in a hushed but intense conversation. "Can't wait, Mr. Richard," Michelle overheard the lawyer say. "The documents must be signed today." Richard looked agitated. "But I haven't made a final decision. I need more time to consider all the implications." Dr. Rodriguez sighed, a flicker of frustration crossing his face. "I understand your hesitation, but the board is pressuring us. If we don't act now, we might lose control of the situation." Michelle shifted, feeling like an intruder. She was about to excuse herself when Richard called her name. "Michelle," he said, his voice filled with an emotion she couldn't quite place. "Would you mind staying? Your perspective might be valuable." Surprised, Michelle nodded and stepped forward hesitantly. Dr. Rodriguez eyed her with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. "Richard," Michelle said gently, "what's going on?" Richard exchanged a look with his lawyer before answering. "Remember the ethical dilemma I mentioned? Well, things got complicated. The board wants an immediate decision, and these documents," he gestured to the folder Dr. Rodriguez was holding, "represent a choice I'm not sure I'm ready to make." Michelle looked from Richard to the lawyer, feeling the immense pressure of the decision hanging in the room. What's the choice? Cut all ties with the supplier immediately, potentially causing a local economic crisis, or maintain the status quo and risk an ethical scandal that could destroy the company's reputation, Dr. Rodriguez explained with clinical precision. Michelle thought for a moment, her mind going back to her earlier conversation with Richard. And the third option, using the company's influence to push for changes? Dr. Rodriguez looked surprised. Third option? Richard managed a slight smile despite the tension. An idea Michelle came up with, one I believe deserves serious consideration. The lawyer frowned. That would complicate things legally. We'd need to draft new contracts, establish monitoring mechanisms. But it would be the right thing to do, Richard interrupted firmly. Michelle watched them, feeling the gravity of the moment. It was surreal to be a part of this, so far removed from her daily life, yet somehow her perspective was being valued. "If I may suggest," she said carefully, "why not postpone the decision by one day? Use that time to fully explore this third option. If it's not feasible, then at least you'll know you considered all alternatives." Richard and Dr. Rodriguez looked at each other, a silent negotiation passing between them. Finally, Richard nodded. "I agree with Michelle. Dr. Rodriguez, please draft a preliminary version of this third option. Tomorrow, we'll make a final decision." The lawyer didn't look entirely happy, but he conceded. "As you wish, Mr. Richard. I'll return tomorrow with the new documents." As Dr. Rodriguez left, Richard turned to Michelle, gratitude clear in his eyes. "Thank you," he said simply. Michelle smiled, feeling a surprising surge of pride. "I'm glad I could help." Looking out the window at her triplets playing happily in the snow, Michelle couldn't help but marvel at how her life had been turned upside down. From a simple cleaner with a broken-down van to an impromptu advisor on corporate ethics. And as she watched Richard, now lost in thought beside her, she sensed this was only the beginning. There were more secrets to uncover, more challenges to face. But for the first time in a long time, she felt ready for whatever came next. With Richard by her side and her children as her reason for everything, she knew she could handle it. The plot was thickening, but maybe that was exactly what they all needed to finally find the answers they were searching for. Night fell over the mansion, blanketing it in a profound silence. The triplets, worn out from a day of play and excitement, were fast asleep in one of the guest suites. Michelle, however, couldn't sleep. She wandered the quiet halls, her mind a whirlwind of unanswered questions. Her steps led her inevitably back to the library, the room where the mystery had begun. Moonlight streamed through the tall windows, casting long, ghostly shadows across the spines of thousands of books. She approached the desk where she'd first seen Elizabeth's picture. She hesitated, feeling like a trespasser, but an overwhelming curiosity won out. Carefully, she slid open the top drawer. What she found made her heart stop. More photos. Dozens of them, all of Elizabeth. Elizabeth smiling on a beach, at her graduation, on her wedding day with Richard. And beneath them, documents, piles and piles of them. Can't sleep? Richard's voice startled her. He was standing in the doorway, holding 2 cups of tea, his expression kind and weary. "I'm sorry," Michelle stammered, quickly closing the drawer. "I shouldn't be snooping." Richard shook his head and walked into the room. "It's all right. Actually, maybe it's time I shared some things with you." He sat in a deep leather armchair and gestured for Michelle to take the one opposite. For a moment, they sat in silence, the only sound the steady ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner. "Elizabeth was adopted," Richard began quietly. "She found out when she was 18, when she needed her documents for college. It was a shock." Michelle listened, rapt, feeling the echo of his pain. From then on, Richard continued, his eyes fixed on some distant point in the past, she became obsessed with finding her biological family. It was like a part of her was missing, you know. "It must have been frustrating," Michelle commented softly. Richard nodded. "It was, but Elizabeth never gave up. Even when she got sick, she kept searching." He stood abruptly and went to the desk, opening the very drawer Michelle had just closed. He pulled out a thick, worn folder. "These are all the documents we gathered over the years," he explained, handing it to her. "Adoption records, DNA test results, private detective reports." With trembling hands, Michelle opened the folder. The first document on top was a copy of Elizabeth's birth certificate. Her eyes widened as she read the date and the place of birth. That's the same town where I was born," she whispered, the words barely audible. Richard looked at her intently. "I know. When you mentioned you were also adopted, I started to wonder if there could be a connection." Michelle continued to flip through the pages, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. There were too many coincidences. Too many points where her own fragmented story seemed to brush up against Elizabeth's. "Richard," she said finally, her voice shaking, do you think Elizabeth and I could be—" "Sisters?" Richard finished gently. "Honestly, Michelle, the more I think about it, the more likely it seems." The silence that followed was heavy, pregnant with the weight of a lifetime of questions. Michelle felt as if the floor had dropped out from under her. To have wondered her whole life, and now to have the answer so tantalizingly close. "There's one more thing," Richard said hesitantly. "Dr. Rodriguez, my lawyer. He didn't just come here to talk about the company dilemma." Michelle looked at him, confused. "He also brought news about the investigation into Elizabeth's origins," Richard continued. "Apparently, they found a promising lead. A former employee of the orphanage where Elizabeth was adopted is willing to talk." "What?" Michelle exclaimed, jumping to her feet. "That's incredible. When can we speak to him?" Richard's expression turned somber. "It's not that simple. The man is very ill in a nursing home. He only agreed to talk if he could see Elizabeth in person." Michelle's heart sank. "But Elizabeth?" "Yes," Richard nodded. "She's not here to do that." The silence fell again, heavier than before. Michelle sank back into the chair, her mind racing. "What if," she began, the idea forming as she spoke, "what if I go in her place?" Richard looked at her, surprised. "Would you do that?" Michelle nodded slowly, a new resolve hardening within her. "If there's a chance to find out the truth, not just about Elizabeth, but about myself, too, I have to try." Richard moved to her, taking both of her hands in his. "Michelle, you have no idea how much this means. To me, to Elizabeth." Michelle felt tears welling in her eyes. I wish I'd had the chance to know her, to have a sister." Richard pulled her into a hug, a gesture that felt both surprising and completely natural. "Maybe it's not too late," he murmured into her hair, "to know her in a way. Through memories, through stories." When they pulled apart, they were both teary-eyed. Michelle took a deep, steadying breath. "So what's the next step?" she asked, her voice filled with determination. Richard smiled, a genuine, hopeful smile that transformed his tired face. "Tomorrow I'll call Dr. Rodriguez. We'll arrange a visit to the nursing home as soon as possible." "Richard," she said softly, "thank you for sharing this with me, for giving me this chance." He squeezed her hand. "No, Michelle, thank you. You've brought hope back to this house. And who knows, maybe we're about to fulfill Elizabeth's last wish." As she left the library, Michelle glanced back at the photo on the desk. The smiling face, so like her own, seemed to look back at her with a silent promise. "I'll find out the truth," Michelle whispered, "for both of us." Later, lying in bed, Michelle replayed every detail of the evening. The coincidences, the similarities, Elizabeth's relentless search. It was all fitting together like pieces of an intricate puzzle. Tomorrow would mark the beginning of a journey she had dreamed of her entire life. Fate had steered her broken-down van to this mansion for a reason. Now, with Richard by her side and the memory of a sister she never knew guiding her, she was ready to face whatever truth the future held, no matter how painful it might be. The wind's howl was a physical force, rattling the great windows of Stonegate Estate with a relentless fury. The predicted snowstorm had arrived with an intensity that had taken everyone by surprise. Michelle stood by a window, watching anxiously as the world outside was erased by a swirling curtain of white. "Looks like we're stuck here for now," Richard commented, joining her. His expression was a mixture of concern for the storm's severity and preoccupation with his looming business decision. Michelle nodded, a strange combination of relief and anxiety settling in her stomach. The storm bought them time to explore the impossible connection between her and Elizabeth, but it also kept her trapped, a world away from her own life and responsibilities. "Are the kids okay?" Richard asked, breaking the silence. "Yes, they're playing upstairs. They seem to think this is a grand adventure," Michelle replied with a small, weary smile. Richard's own smile didn't quite reach his eyes. "Michelle, I need to make a decision about the company. Today. I can't postpone it any longer." Michelle turned to face him, noting the deep lines of worry etched around his eyes. "What are you thinking of doing?" Richard sighed, the sound heavy with the weight of his choice. "I'm leaning towards your suggestion, using our influence to push for changes instead of simply cutting ties. But it's risky. If it doesn't work, we could lose everything." "So sometimes doing the right thing is risky," Michelle said softly. "But in the end, you'll be able to look yourself in the mirror knowing you tried." Richard looked at her with a mix of gratitude and open admiration. "How did you get so wise, Michelle?" She shrugged, a sad smile touching her lips. "Life has a way of teaching us hard lessons." At that moment, the sound of thundering footsteps broke the tension. The triplets burst into the room, their faces alight with excitement. "Mom, Mr. Richard, look what we found!" Ethan exclaimed, holding up a dusty, leather-bound photo album. Michelle and Richard exchanged a look of surprise before moving toward the children. Madison opened the album, revealing yellowed photographs and aged documents. "Where did you find this?" Richard asked, his voice strained. "In the closet upstairs," Sophia answered innocently. "It was hidden behind some boxes." Michelle leaned in closer to look at the photos. Her heart began to beat faster. She recognized Elizabeth in many of them, but there were other older photos of people she'd never seen. "Richard, who are these people?" she asked, pointing to a specific picture of two young women standing side by side. Richard took the album, his eyes widening as he stared at the image. That's Elizabeth's adoptive mother. And the other woman? I'm not sure. But Elizabeth always thought she might be her biological mother. Michelle felt the air leave her lungs. The woman in the photo, the one presumed to be Elizabeth's birth mother, bore an uncanny resemblance to herself. "Richard," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the storm's roar. "This woman. She looks like me." Richard looked from the photograph to Michelle, then back to the photo, the pieces clicking into place with a stunning finality. "My God," he murmured, "how did we not see this before?" The children, sensing the sudden heavy tension, grew quiet, their eyes darting between the adults. "Mom?" Madison asked hesitantly. "Do you know these people?" Michelle knelt, trying to keep her voice steady for her children. "No, sweetheart. But they might be part of our family we never knew." "We have more family?" Liam asked, his eyes shining with hope. "Maybe," Michelle answered, her gaze meeting Richard's over the children's heads. "We're trying to find out." Richard sat down heavily on the edge of a sofa, the album resting on his lap. "Michelle, this changes everything. If that woman is really Elizabeth's biological mother, and yours—" "It could be just a coincidence," Michelle interrupted, but the words sounded hollow even to her own ears. "How many coincidences do we need before we accept it might be true?" Richard asked softly. Michelle closed her eyes, feeling the crushing weight of a lifetime of unanswered questions. When she opened them, her expression was one of pure determination. "We need to know more," she said firmly. "About that woman, about Elizabeth's adoption, about everything." Richard nodded, already reaching for his phone. "I'll call Dr. Rodriguez right now. Storm or not, we need to act." While Richard was on the phone, Michelle found herself enveloped by the triplets, their small faces a mixture of confusion and curiosity. "Mom, are we getting an aunt?" Sophie asked. Tears pricked at Michelle's eyes. "I don't know, my love, but we're trying to find out." "What about a grandpa and a grandma?" Ethan added hopefully. "Maybe," Michelle replied, pulling all three of them into a fierce hug. "But remember, you three are my family, no matter what happens." Richard ended the call, his face a mask of complex emotions. "Dr. Rodriguez is on his way. He says he has important information that can't wait." "But the storm," Michelle began, glancing at the window where the blizzard raged on. "He insisted," Richard said. "He said it's crucial we talk today." The next few hours passed in a tense, anxious blur. The children, sensing the gravity of the situation, played quietly in a corner of the living room, while Michelle and Richard pored over every photograph and document in the album, searching for more clues. When the doorbell finally rang, its sound cutting sharply through the howl of the wind, they all jumped. Richard went to answer it, returning a moment later with Dr. Rodriguez, who was covered in snow and clutching a thick briefcase. "Ladies and gentlemen," the attorney began, his tone grave, "I have news that will change everything." Michelle felt her heart hammer against her ribs. She looked at Richard, at her children, and back at the lawyer. In that instant, she knew with absolute certainty that her life was about to be irrevocably altered. The storm raging outside was a perfect mirror for the emotional tempest brewing within the walls of Stonegate Estate. Secrets, long buried, were about to be unearthed, and nothing would ever be the same again. Michelle took a deep breath, bracing herself for whatever was to come. For herself, for her children, and for the sister she never knew. The night that would change everything had only just begun. The storm still raged, but inside the mansion a stunned, heavy silence had fallen. Dr. Rodriguez had just departed, leaving Michelle and Richard reeling from the news he had delivered. The children, sensing the somber mood, had retreated to their room to play. Michelle sat on the sofa, her gaze fixed on the crackling flames in the fireplace, trying to process it all. Richard joined her, placing a steaming cup of tea in her hands. "Thank you," she murmured, her own hands trembling as she took the cup. "How are you feeling?" Richard asked gently, sitting beside her. Michelle let out a shaky breath. "Honestly, I don't know. It's a lot to process." "I know," Richard said, his voice full of understanding. "Finding out that you and Elizabeth were truly biological sisters, that's a lot." "Sisters," Michelle repeated, the word feeling foreign on her tongue. My whole life I wondered if I had family somewhere. And now you know you did, Richard finished softly. Tears welled in Michelle's eyes. But I never got the chance to meet her, to really have a sister. Richard placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. Maybe you can know her through my memories, through the stories I can tell. Michelle looked at him, her expression full of gratitude. I would like that. They sat in a comfortable silence, the only sound the pop and hiss of the fire. Richard, Michelle began hesitantly, can I ask you something personal? He nodded, encouraging her. How was it, losing Elizabeth and never having the chance to have children? Richard closed his eyes for a moment, a spasm of pain crossing his face. When he opened them, they were misty. It is a pain that never fully goes away, he said, his voice rough with emotion. Elizabeth was my best friend, my partner in everything. Losing her was like losing part of myself. Michelle listened, her heart aching for him. As for children, he continued, that was Elizabeth's dream. We tried for years, went through treatments, but it never happened. When she got sick, that dream died with her. I'm sorry, Michelle whispered, placing her hand on his. He offered a sad smile. Seeing you with your triplets? It's a bittersweet reminder of what could have been. A lump formed in Michelle's throat. They're my life, she said softly. But it wasn't always easy. Richard looked at her, his curiosity piqued, silently prompting her to go on. Michelle took a deep breath. Their father. He's not in the picture. Never was. He abandoned you? Richard asked, a surprising note of anger in his voice. Michelle shook her head. He never even knew about them. It was a one-night encounter. By the time I realized I was pregnant, there was no way to contact him. Richard looked shocked. You faced it all alone? I had no choice, Michelle shrugged. It was scary at first. A triplet pregnancy, no family, not much money. But every challenge made me stronger. Richard regarded her with a look of profound admiration and respect. You're incredible, Michelle. Truly incredible. Before she could respond, a sharp cry echoed from the children's room. They both shot to their feet, rushing to see what was wrong. They found Sophia sitting bolt upright in bed, crying, while Madison and Ethan watched with worried faces. What's wrong, sweetheart? Michelle asked, hurrying to her daughter's side. My tummy hurts, Sophia sobbed, and I'm cold. Michelle pressed a hand to Sophia's forehead. She was burning up. She's got a fever, Michelle said to Richard, her voice tight with concern. Richard nodded, already moving with purpose. I'll get the thermometer and some medicine. We have a well-stocked first aid kit in the bathroom. In the minutes that followed, they worked as a seamless team. Richard took Sophia's temperature while Michelle prepared a cool compress. Together, they managed to coax some fever-reducing medicine into the crying child. You'll be all right, Princess, Richard murmured, the gentle nickname surprising even himself. Michelle looked at him, touched by his natural tenderness. Seeing him care for her daughter so competently made something deep inside her melt. The next few hours were a blur of quiet vigilance. They took turns checking on Sophia, reassuring Madison and Ethan, and keeping each other company in the dim hallway. During one of these watches in the dead of night, Michelle found Richard looking exhausted, but resolute. How is she? He asked immediately. The fever's going down, Michelle replied, relief washing over her. Thank you, Richard, for everything. He gave her a gentle smile. You don't have to thank me. I care about you all of you. A charged silence hung between them, filled with all the things they hadn't said. Then, without thinking, Michelle stepped forward and hugged him. He tensed for a second in surprise, then relaxed, his arms coming around her to hold her close. They stood that way for a long moment, drawing strength and comfort from each other. When they finally pulled apart, a new intimacy, a silent understanding, had formed between them. We should try to get some sleep, Michelle said softly. Richard nodded. "Wake me if you need anything." Returning to the bedroom, Michelle lay down beside Sophia, gently stroking her hair. Her thoughts drifted to Richard, to the stunning revelations of the night, and to the strange, temporary family they were becoming under this snowbound roof. For the first time in a very long time, Michelle allowed herself to think about the future with a flicker of hope. Whatever lay ahead, she was no longer facing it alone. And that, she realized, made all the difference. The silence in the room was so thick it was almost a physical presence, broken only by the ticking of the grandfather clock and the howl of the wind. Dr. Rodriguez had just left, and his words hung in the air, a stunning, life-altering revelation. Michelle and Richard sat in stunned silence, trying to process what they had just learned. "Repeat it, please," Michelle finally asked, her voice a near whisper. "I need to hear it again." Dr. Rodriguez cleared his throat, adjusting his glasses. "The records we found confirm beyond a shadow of a doubt that you, Miss Michelle, and the late Mrs. Elizabeth, Mr. Richard's wife, were biological sisters. You were separated as infants and placed for adoption into different families." Richard, who was holding Michelle's hand, squeezed it gently. His eyes were shining with a mixture of tears and 1,000 other emotions. How is that possible?" Michelle asked, her mind struggling to catch up. "All these years, and we never knew." The lawyer opened a folder and slid some documents across the coffee table. "Apparently, your biological mother was very young when she had you both, twins. She couldn't care for both of you, and fearing you'd be separated in the system, she chose to give you to different families, hoping each would have a better chance." Tears began to stream silently down Michelle's cheeks. A sister. She'd had a sister this whole time, and she'd never known. And now it was too late. "Elizabeth," she murmured, looking at Richard. "Did she know?" Richard shook his head, his own voice thick with unshed tears. "No, she always suspected she had a sister, but we never had concrete proof. She spent years searching, but the cancer took her before she could find out," Michelle finished, a sharp physical pain lancing through her chest. "We also found records of your biological mother," Dr. Rodriguez continued gently. "She passed away a few years ago, but she left letters for both of you." He handed 2 yellowed sealed envelopes to Michelle. She took them with trembling hands, her eyes tracing the delicate faded handwriting on the front. "To my Michelle and to my Elizabeth." I don't know if I can read this now," Michelle said, her voice breaking. Richard put an arm around her, pulling her close. "You don't have to. Not right now. We can wait until you're ready." Michelle nodded, grateful for his steady presence. She looked at Dr. Rodriguez. "Is there anything else we need to know?" The attorney hesitated. "There are medical records. The condition that took Elizabeth, it's genetic." Michelle felt the blood drain from her face. "You mean that you should get tested?" "Yes," Dr. Rodriguez confirmed softly. "It's just a precaution, but it's important," Richard completed, his own face pale at the memory of Elizabeth's battle. Michelle nodded, a wave of exhaustion washing over her. It was too much. A sister she'd never known, a mother she'd never met, and now the looming specter of a hereditary illness. "Mom?" Sophia's voice cut through the heavy atmosphere. The children, who had been asked to play in another room, were now peeking around the doorway, their faces etched with worry. Michelle forced a smile and opened her arms. The triplets rushed to her, surrounding her in a cocoon of warmth. "It's okay, my loves," she murmured, kissing their heads. "Mom just got some surprising news." "Good or bad news?" Ethan asked with childish directness. Michelle exchanged a look with Richard before answering. "A bit of both. But the most important thing is that we have each other, right?" Richard joined the group hug, his strong arms enveloping Michelle and the children. "Exactly. We're a family, no matter what." Dr. Rodriguez stood quietly, recognizing his cue to leave. "I'll be in touch." "If you have any questions," he said softly, before letting himself out. Once they were alone, Michelle finally let the tears fall freely. She wept for the sister she'd never known, the mother she'd never met, and for all the lost years. Richard held her, his own silent tears dampening her hair. "I'm so sorry, Michelle," he whispered. "I'm so sorry you and Elizabeth never got to meet." Michelle looked up into his eyes. "But we have met, in a way, haven't we? Through you, through these memories, through this inexplicable connection we felt from the start." Richard nodded, a sad smile touching his lips. "Elizabeth would have adored you, and these children. She always wanted to be an aunt." The kids, sensing the deep emotion of the moment, hugged them tighter. "So we really did have an aunt?" Madison asked softly. Michelle nodded, stroking her daughter's hair. "Yes, sweetheart, a very special aunt who, unfortunately, is no longer with us." "But she's still part of our family, right?" Ethan asked. "Always," Richard replied, his voice firm despite the tears. "Elizabeth will always be part of this family." As the night wore on and the storm outside finally began to subside, the five of them remained huddled together, a strange, new family forged in grief and revelation. Michelle knew the coming days would be a difficult journey of processing, decision-making, and exploring a past she never knew she had. But as she looked at Richard and her children, she felt a surge of strength. They would face it all together. And somehow, in some way, Michelle felt that Elizabeth was smiling down on them, finally at peace, knowing her sister had at last found her way home. The days following the revelation were an emotional blur for Michelle. Sitting on the grand terrace of Stonegate Estate, watching the triplets engage in a vigorous snowball fight with Richard, she tried to make sense of the new shape of her life. The discovery of her sisterhood with Elizabeth was a complex tapestry of joy, sorrow, and a strange, lingering guilt as she found herself growing closer to Richard. "A penny for your thoughts?" Richard's voice pulled her from her reverie. He sat beside her, handing her a mug of hot chocolate. Michelle accepted it with a grateful smile, just processing it all. "It's a lot to absorb," Richard agreed. "How are you dealing with it?" she asked, turning to face him. Richard was quiet for a moment, his gaze fixed on the snow-covered Aspen landscape. "It's strange," he said finally. "On one hand, I feel Elizabeth is closer than ever. On the other, it's a painful reminder of your loss," Michelle finished softly. "Exactly," Richard said. "But you know what? Seeing you with the children, hearing your stories, it's as if part of Elizabeth is still here." Michelle's heart clenched. "I wish I had known her. She would have loved you," Richard said with a confident smile. "And these kids, she would have been absolutely enchanted." As if on cue, a joyful shout erupted from the yard. Ethan had scored a direct hit on Richard with a perfectly packed snowball and was now scrambling for cover. "Come join us," Madison yelled, waving enthusiastically. Michelle laughed, setting down her mug. "I guess we're being summoned." The afternoon dissolved into a happy chaos of laughter, snow forts, and building a slightly lopsided snowman. Michelle watched, amazed, as Richard shed the skin of the serious, burdened executive and became a playful, engaged participant in the children's world. Later, while the kids were napping, Michelle found Richard in his office, surrounded by paperwork. "Working hard?" she asked, knocking on the open door. Richard looked up, a tired but satisfied smile on his face. "Implementing some changes in the company. That idea you gave me about using our influence to improve working conditions. We're putting it into practice." A surge of pride warmed Michelle. "That's wonderful, Richard. It will make a big difference in so many lives." "All thanks to you," he replied, his gaze intense. "You reminded me of what really matters." A quiet, charged moment passed between them. Michelle felt her heart begin to beat a little faster. "Richard, she began, but was interrupted by a small whirlwind. "Uncle Richard!" Sophia exclaimed, bursting into the office and throwing her arms around his legs. "Can you read us a story? Richard laughed, scooping her up into his arms. "Sure I can, Princess. Why don't we call your siblings and make it a group story time?" Michelle watched, moved, as he left the office with Sophia, his voice already calling for Madison and Ethan. The ease with which he was slipping into a fatherly role was both astonishing and heartwarming. That night, after the children were tucked in, they met in the library. The fire crackled, casting a warm glow on the leather-bound books. "The kids really adore you," Michelle commented, accepting the glass of wine Richard poured for her. "And I adore them," Richard replied sincerely. "They've brought so much life and joy back into this house. And to me." A knot formed in Michelle's throat. "Richard, I don't know how to thank you for everything you've done for us." Richard set his own glass down and turned to face her fully. "Michelle, you don't need to thank me. Having you and the children here, it's like I finally found something I didn't know I was missing." Their eyes met, and Michelle felt a wave of emotion so strong it almost took her breath away. There was a connection between them, something that went beyond their shared link to Elizabeth. It was new and terrifying and wonderful. "I know it's complicated," Richard continued softly. "Our story, our connections. But I can't deny what I'm feeling." Michelle took a deep breath, her heart hammering. "I feel it too, Richard. And it scares me. It's like we're betraying Elizabeth somehow." Richard took her hands in his. "I've thought a lot about that. And you know what? I believe Elizabeth would be happy. Happy that we found each other, that we're taking care of each other." Tears welled in Michelle's eyes. "You think so?" "I'm sure of it," Richard said firmly. "Elizabeth always wanted me to be happy. And you, Michelle, you make me happy." In that moment, with the firelight dancing around them, and the memory of Elizabeth feeling more like a blessing than a barrier, Michelle and Richard leaned toward each other. Their lips met in a soft, tentative kiss that was full of promise and unspoken questions. When they pulled apart, they both had tears in their eyes, but they were also smiling. "So what do we do now?" Michelle asked, her voice a whisper. Richard smiled gently, his thumb caressing her cheek. "Now, we build something new, together, one day at a time." Michelle nodded, a feeling of hope and happiness surging through her. Here, in Richard's arms, with her children sleeping safely upstairs, she finally felt like she was home. The journey to rebuild their lives was just beginning, but with love, understanding, and the memory of a sister guiding them, she knew they could face whatever came next, together, as a family. Dawn painted the sky over the Aspen peaks in soft shades of pink and orange. Michelle woke with a stretch, still feeling the lingering warmth of Richard's embrace from the night before. The past few days had been an emotional whirlwind, but for the first time in as long as she could remember, she felt a deep sense of peace. Making her way downstairs, she was drawn by the sounds of happy chatter from the kitchen. She paused in the doorway, taking in the scene. Richard, still in his pajama pants, was at the stove flipping pancakes, while the triplets sat perched at the massive island, talking a mile a minute. "Uncle Richard, you make the best pancakes in the world," Ethan declared around a mouthful of food. Richard laughed, a playful, easy sound as he ruffled the boy's hair. "Thanks, champ. Just don't tell your mom. She might get jealous." "Too late," Michelle said, stepping into the room with a grin. "My pancake secrets have officially been surpassed." The children squealed with delight at her appearance, scrambling down from their stools to give her a group hug. Richard looked over at her, his expression full of a tenderness and joy she'd never seen in him before. After breakfast, once the children were engrossed in building a Lego castle in the living room, Richard asked to speak with Michelle privately. In his office, she noticed a new tension in his shoulders. "Is everything okay?" she asked, a flicker of concern in her voice. Richard took a deep breath, as if steeling himself. "Michelle, I have something important to tell you. Or rather, to propose." Her heart started to race. "What is it, Richard?" He took her hands, his gaze steady and sincere. These past days, with you and the kids, they've been the happiest I've had in years. You've brought life back into this house, and into me." Michelle smiled softly, squeezing his hands. "I've always dreamed of being a father," Richard continued, his voice thick with emotion. "Elizabeth and I tried so hard, and now, seeing you with the triplets, I realized I still want that, more than ever." Michelle's breath caught in her throat, a premonition of what was coming next. "Michelle," Richard said, his voice firm, "I want you and the children to stay. Permanently. Not just as guests, but as family." She stared at him, speechless. "More than that," he went on, "I'd like to legally adopt the triplets, and if you'll allow it, I want to be their father in every sense of the word." Tears began to stream down Michelle's face. "Richard, I don't know what to say. This is huge." "I know it's a big decision," Richard said, his tone full of understanding. "And I understand if you need time to think. But I want you to know, I'm serious. You four are the family I've always dreamed of." A torrent of emotions washed over Michelle: gratitude, love, fear, hope. "Richard, I'm touched, truly. But are you sure? 3 kids at once. It's a lot of responsibility." A brilliant smile lit up Richard's face. "I've never been so sure of anything in my life. Michelle, I love those children as if they were my own. And you, well, I think you know how I feel about you." Michelle blushed, the memory of their kiss still warm. "I love you too, Richard," she whispered. They embraced, a hug filled with tears and unspoken promises. When they parted, she said, "I think we should talk to the kids. They need to have a say in this too." Richard agreed. Together they called the triplets into the office. "What's up, Mom?" Sophia asked, her eyes wide with curiosity. Richard and Michelle exchanged a look before he knelt down to the children's level. "Madison, Ethan, Sophia," he began softly, "you know that I love you very much, right?" The 3 of them nodded enthusiastically. "Well," Richard continued, "I've been talking to your mom, and we wondered how you'd feel if I became your dad. Officially?" There was a moment of stunned silence before Madison shouted, "You mean we can call you Daddy?" Richard let out a choked laugh, his eyes shining. "Yes, sweetheart, if you want to." Ethan frowned, a thoughtful look on his face. "But what about our other dad?" Michelle knelt beside Richard. "Remember, honey, you never met your biological father. Uncle Richard. Richard wants to be a real dad to you, someone who's always here, who loves and cares for you." Sophia, who had been unusually quiet, suddenly launched herself into Richard's arms. "I want you to be my daddy," she whispered into his shoulder. Richard held her tight, his own tears finally falling. "I'd love to be your dad, Princess." Madison and Ethan quickly joined the hug, and Michelle watched, her heart so full of love and gratitude it felt like it might burst. When they finally untangled themselves, a mess of teary eyes and huge smiles, Richard looked at Michelle. "And you, my love? What do you say? Shall we make this mansion our home? Become a family?" Michelle looked at her children, then at the man who had so unexpectedly stumbled into their lives, and she knew the answer. "Yes," she said, her voice clear and strong despite her tears. "Yes to everything." The room erupted in cheers. The children bounced and danced. Richard spun Michelle around in his arms, and for a perfect shining moment, everything was right in the world. Later that night, long after the kids had finally fallen asleep, still buzzing with excitement, Michelle and Richard sat on the terrace, gazing at the star-dusted sky. "Are you sure you're ready for this?" Michelle asked softly. 3 6-year-olds? It's quite a change." Richard smiled, pulling her closer. "I've never been more certain. You 4 are the gift I never knew I needed." Michelle rested her head on his shoulder. "You know, for years I wondered why my life was so hard, why I had no family, why I struggled so much. Now I see it all led me to this moment, to you." Richard kissed the top of her head. Elizabeth always said there are no coincidences, only destined meetings. I think she was right. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, absorbing the magnitude of their new reality. "Tomorrow we'll start the legal preparations," Richard said, "for the adoption, for transferring the kids to the local school." Michelle nodded, a wave of gratitude so profound it was almost overwhelming. "Richard, thank you for giving us a home, a family." He lifted her chin, his eyes locking with hers in the starlight. "No, my love, thank you for giving me the family I always dreamed of." Their lips met in a kiss that was no longer tentative, but full of the promise of a shared future. Under the vast Aspen sky, with the sound of her children's soft breathing drifting from an open window, Michelle knew she had finally found her place. Richard's unexpected decision had changed everything, and while the road ahead would surely have its own challenges, she knew that together, as a family, they could face anything. The weeks following Richard's decision were a whirlwind of activity. Stonegate Estate, once a bastion of quiet solitude, now buzzed with life, punctuated by enthusiastic debates over bedroom wall colors and furniture placement. One bright morning, Michelle and Richard sat in his office, surrounded by stacks of legal documents. Dr. Rodriguez, seated across the massive desk, explained the nuances of the adoption process. "The fact that you two aren't married might complicate things slightly," the lawyer noted, adjusting his glasses. "But given Mr. Richards' impeccable record and financial stability, I don't foresee major hurdles." Michelle bit her lip. What about the children's biological father, even though he was never present? "Don't worry," Dr. Rodriguez assured her. "Since he never claimed paternity and isn't on the birth certificate, his rights are practically non-existent." Richard squeezed Michelle's hand. "We'll get through this together, my love, one step at a time." While the adults navigated the bureaucracy, the triplets were navigating their own adjustments. Madison, always the social butterfly, was thrilled by the prospect of a new dad and a new life. Ethan, however, seemed more reserved. One afternoon, Michelle found him sitting alone in the sprawling garden, pushing a toy car back and forth in the dirt. "Everything okay, honey?" she asked, sitting beside him. Ethan just shrugged, avoiding her eyes. Michelle put an arm around his small shoulders. "You know you can tell me anything, right?" The boy was quiet for a long moment before finally speaking. "Mom, what if Uncle Richard, Dad, gets tired of us? What if he doesn't want us anymore?" Michelle's heart ached at the fear in his voice. "Oh, Ethan," she said softly, "Richard loves you. He chose to be your dad. That's not something people do lightly." "But what if he changes his mind?" Ethan insisted, finally looking up at her. Just then, Richard appeared, carrying a toolbox. Seeing their serious faces, he approached with a smile. "Hey, champ," he said, sensing Ethan's mood. "How about helping me fix your mom's car?" "It's about time we got that old friend running again." Ethan's eyes lit up. "Really?" "Of course," Richard replied, ruffling the boy's hair affectionately. "Every dad needs a good helper, right?" Michelle watched, touched, as the two of them headed toward the garage. The way Richard so naturally assumed the role of a father, always including the children, always reassuring them, warmed her to her core. In the days that followed, Richard threw himself into mastering the art of fatherhood. There were moments of frustration, like the time he tried to convince Sophia to take her cold medicine. "Come on, princess," he pleaded, holding the sticky spoon. "Just one quick sip." Sophia crossed her arms, her lower lip trembling. "I don't want it. It's gross." Michelle, watching from the doorway, stepped in. "Hey, Sophie," she called, grabbing a glass of juice. "How about we take our medicine together? I'll take a sip of my special medicine, and you take yours. Whoever makes the funniest face wins, okay?" Sophia's eyes lit up at the challenge, and moments later, the medicine was gone, followed by a fit of giggles. Richard looked at Michelle in awe. "How do you make it seem so easy?" Michelle smiled. "Years of practice." But you're doing great, love. It's just a matter of time and patience. The family rhythm began to solidify. Mornings were a controlled chaos of getting 3 kids ready for school, with Richard on lunchbox duty while Michelle handled braids. Evenings were for family dinners and story time, where Richard discovered a talent for creating unique voices for every character, to the children's delight. It wasn't always a fairy tale. There were arguments over screen time, squabbles over whose turn it was to choose the movie, and the occasional epic meltdown. One particularly trying evening, after a day of non-stop drama, Michelle and Richard collapsed on the terrace, exhausted. "Sometimes I wonder if I'm doing the right thing," Richard confessed, running a hand through his hair. "What if I'm not good enough for them?" Michelle moved closer, wrapping her arms around him. "You are more than enough, Richard. Being a father isn't about being perfect. It's about being there, loving unconditionally, and always trying to improve." He kissed her gently. "What would I do without you? You'd probably be lost trying to figure out how to use the washing machine," she teased, lightening the mood. They laughed, the sound a welcome release in the quiet night. The next day, Richard came home with a surprise. "A puppy?" "I thought we could add another family member," he explained, as the children shrieked with joy and swarmed the Labrador Retriever. Michelle raised an eyebrow. "A dog? Are we sure we're ready for this?" Richard smiled, pulling her into a hug. "I think it's a great way to teach responsibility. Besides, every family needs a pet, right?" Watching the kids tumble on the lawn with their new furry friend, Michelle couldn't help but agree. This was her family now, imperfect, noisy, and absolutely wonderful. After weeks of tinkering, the old Dodge Caravan finally roared to life, its engine humming with a steady, reliable rhythm. "We did it!" Ethan shouted, jumping up and down. Richard grinned, wiping grease from his hands. "Yes, champ, we did. Now this old friend is ready for many new adventures." Michelle looked at the van, a wave of nostalgia and hope washing over her. It had carried her through so much hardship. Now it would be a part of their new beginning. "How about a drive?" she suggested. "All of us, together." Within minutes they were all piled in, the new puppy, Max, happily squeezed between the kids. As Richard drove through the charming streets of Aspen, Michelle looked at the smiling faces of her children, at the incredible man beside her, and at the bright, open road ahead. She knew there would be more challenges, more moments of doubt. But looking at her beautiful, chaotic family, she was certain that together they could handle anything. The old van, once a symbol of her solitary struggle, now carried an entire family, ready to embark on a new journey of love, growth, and endless possibilities. The scent of fresh pine and baking cookies filled Stonegate Estate, a home now vibrant and unrecognizable from the silent mansion of a year ago. Laughter and the patter of running feet were the new soundtrack. Michelle stood in the living room, a soft smile on her face, as the triplets, now a confident 7 years old, decorated a towering Christmas tree. Richard was perched precariously on a stepladder, attempting to place the star on top, guided by a chorus of conflicting instructions. "A little more to the left, Dad," Madison directed. "No, to the right," Ethan countered. Richard laughed, climbing down. "How about we decide this democratically?" Michelle approached, hugging Sophia from behind. "What do you think, sweetheart? Where should the star go?" Sophia studied the tree with a thoughtful frown before declaring, "I think it's perfect right in the middle." Richard smiled, catching Michelle's eye. Wise words from our little diplomat. In the middle, it is. As he climbed back up, Michelle reflected on the incredible transformation of the past year. The adoption had been finalized 6 months prior in a tearful, joyful courtroom ceremony. The doorbell rang, pulling her from her thoughts. "It must be Aunt Mary," Ethan exclaimed, racing for the door. Michelle smiled. Her own life had flourished too. With Richard's encouragement and investment, she had launched a high-end cleaning service from old to new, Michelle's Cleaning Services, which had quickly become the most sought after in Aspen. "Merry Christmas, everyone." Mary, a friend who had become like family, entered, laden with gifts, and was immediately mobbed by the children. The afternoon was a happy blur of preparations for the holiday feast, with everyone pitching in. Michelle watched Richard patiently showing Ethan how to stuff the turkey, her heart so full it felt like it might overflow. Later, after the children were asleep, she and Richard stood on the terrace, watching the snow fall in gentle, silent flakes. "To think that a year ago we were stuck here because of a storm," Richard murmured, pulling her close. She smiled, resting her head on his shoulder. Who knew that storm would bring us so much? Richard took her hand, his fingers tracing the simple, elegant engagement ring on her finger. "Speaking of bringing good things, have you decided on a wedding date?" Michelle looked down at the ring, her heart doing a little flutter. "How about New Year's Eve? A new year, a new beginning." Richard's eyes lit up. "Perfect, just like you." The days flew by, and soon it was New Year's Eve. The mansion was aglow, decorated for the double celebration. Michelle, in a simple but stunning white dress, looked at her reflection, marveling at the happy, confident woman staring back. The triplets, looking dapper in their party clothes, came into her room. Sophie held out a small, beautifully wrapped box. Inside was a delicate, hand-painted ornament, a perfect replica of her old Dodge Caravan. "For you to remember where we came from," Sophia explained, "and how far we've come." Michelle hugged them all, moved to tears. "It's perfect, my loves. Absolutely perfect." The ceremony was intimate and deeply emotional. When Richard saw Michelle walking towards him, flanked by her 3 children, his eyes filled with tears. They exchanged vows of love, respect, and partnership, sealing their promises with a passionate kiss as their friends and family cheered. At midnight, as the countdown echoed through the house, Richard found her on the terrace. "Happy New Year, Mrs. Thompson," he whispered, pulling her into a kiss. "Happy New Year, Mr. Thompson," she replied, her smile radiant. The sudden honk of a car horn startled them. In the circular driveway, bathed in the glow of the mansion's lights, was her old Dodge Caravan, fully restored, gleaming, and decorated with a just married sign. "Surprise!" the triplets yelled from the doorway. "It's our wedding gift to you." Michelle and Richard descended the steps, amazed. The old van, once a symbol of her struggle, was now a testament to their journey, their resilience, and the love that bound them. "How about a ride?" Richard suggested, holding the door open. With the triplets laughing in the back, Michelle and Richard drove through the quiet, snowy streets. The world was lit by festive lights and the occasional burst of fireworks. Michelle looked at the incredible man beside her, her wonderful children behind her, and the bright future ahead, her heart overflowing. From a lonely cleaner in a broken-down van to a fulfilled woman with a loving family and a thriving business, her journey was a testament to the unexpected turns of life. When they returned, the party was still going. The house, once cold and imposing, was filled with warmth and love. Richard raised a glass. "I'd like to make a toast," he announced, "to my beautiful wife, Michelle, who brought light back into my life, to our wonderful children, who teach us something new every day, and to all of you, our chosen family." Michelle raised her own glass, tears of joy in her eyes. "And to love," she added, "which finds us in the most unexpected moments and transforms our lives in ways we never imagined possible." As the celebration continued, she allowed herself a final moment of reflection. A year ago, she was struggling to keep her head above water. Now she stood in the center of a beautiful, chaotic, loving family. The old van, parked proudly out front, was a constant reminder of how far she'd come. As the party wound down and the house grew quiet, they found themselves back on the terrace, watching the first sunrise of the new year. "Happy 2025, my love," Richard whispered, hugging her from behind. Michelle leaned back into his embrace, a profound sense of peace settling over her. "Happy new beginning, Richard." And so, with the dawn of a new year, Michelle knew she was exactly where she was meant to be. The road had been hard, but every single struggle had been worth it. The future was bright, and with Richard and the triplets by her side, she was ready for any adventure. This wasn't just a happy ending, it was the beginning of a beautiful new chapter.